We also have the very same top 10 list that Steve Morawski had for sea image, because we've done that all as well, so I don't have to go through all of our major accomplishments, because we probably have a few more than he had on his slide. So. When we began the Coastal Waters Consortium, we had a lot of background data when people said there's no such thing as background data in the Gulf of Mexico. And we went out and got some data before the spill hit the Louisiana marshes. So ours is focused primarily on inland and nearshore continental shelf, which is very different from the other consortia, which are focused primarily out in the deep Gulf of Mexico. We wanted to follow the oil, find out what it was doing, see if there's recovery, resilience, or not. Look at some of the impacts on the organisms and also with the food web. So I'm approaching this talk with what some of our expectations might have been, or what the public might have expected at the beginning of this spill, and some of the knowledge that we have now. And I cannot cover everything that we did in this consortium, but I'll do my best to give you some highlights. First of all, the oil is just going to go away right away. Well, some of it did, because the half-life of some of these compounds is very short, less than a week. However, the oil does not disappear quickly, because some of the compounds are not going to degrade rapidly, and they're going to be in the system for quite a while, which Ed Overton has shown with this diagram over 4 years, that we're still tracking the biomarkers and some of the oil from the Deepwater Horizon in Louisiana coastal marshes. We can take you to a place, we know there's vapors emitted in the summer, we can show you where the oil is. The oil that has been covered by sediments in anaerobic places is not degrading the same as the oil in more exposed conditions. We also know that things are aging differently. I mean, oil, bless Ed Overton, oil is a very complex compound, and I love to hear him talk about oil, but it's mind-boggling. And one thing that we do know now from our work is we know very good details on how this oil has transformed in marsh environments over a 4-year period. So some of the compounds are going to go away fairly rapidly. Some of them are going to be there for a bit longer. This is some work from Turner and others that shows that the alkanes are going to degrade faster, and you would predict that they would get back to background the same much sooner, and that the aromatics seem to be sticking around a lot longer. What we're finding now is that it's sometimes very difficult to find the concentration of oil, but we can still sometimes find the indicators that it was Deepwater Horizon, or the indicators tell us that it had nothing to do with Deepwater Horizon. We thought that the marshes, or maybe some people thought, one marsh is just like every other marsh, and when it gets oil on it, it's going to respond just like every other marsh that gets oil on it. But we found that, of course, it's not homogeneous the way the oil was dispersed, and we know that the oil was redispersed during Hurricane Isaac. So oiling within 5 meters of the marsh, 10 meters of the marsh, then became oiling 100 meters from the marsh edge in some of the cases. So a simple before and after control, oiled and unoiled experimental design did not really come out as favorable as we would like to have seen. So sometimes we wonder, is this an oiled marsh? Or was it ever an oiled marsh? Or was it an oiled marsh at the beginning, but now the sides of the marsh have eroded away and it's not oiled anymore, and the oil from the Isaac is now 100 meters into the marsh, and it was a very difficult way to approach things. But we did get out, we got fresh oil, fresh in the marsh, and we've been following it ever since with the impacts on various parts of the food web. We heard the oceanographer at the very beginning talk about, getting that grid down to 30 meters. Well, that's really good, but, we need to be a little more precise when we're tracking oil into the estuaries. And the FVCOM model that Dubravko Justic and others have developed gets us within 18 meters and can tell us much better where the oil is going to go, and it compares very well with the SCAT designations from NOAA. So we've got this, they have this down to 8 meters now, and we're going to be adding sediments to this model. We've had water, we've had smart particles that act like oil, and now we're going to have particles that are really particles, mineral particles, put into this to look at the way oil disperses into the nooks and crannies of the estuaries. In particular, we looked at Barataria Bay, and it's been validated by the data that has been collected since. Also, these models were very helpful in determining whether some remediation was successful or not. This particular model was used to illustrate the diversion of river water to the east to keep the oil out of the marshes, and the model showed that only about 20 to 25 kilometers from that model, or from that freshwater diversion, was water circulation affected, and that in fact it was not at all effective in keeping oil out of the marsh. This same model is going to be used looking at future possibilities of large diversions and moving around materials in the Louisiana estuaries. There were some early predictions. Look at this green grass. This marsh is healthy. But you had to look a little bit longer than 2 months or 3 months. We've been following some of these marshes, and there's very obvious shoreline erosion and falling off of this marsh material. You can see how the marsh is undercut. A lot of the organic matter that's being held together by these roots has been degraded, and sooner or later that particular part of the marsh is going to fall off into the water. The marsh edge at the very top of the figure shows a somewhat smooth shoreline, and then some of these parts of the marsh start dropping off, which leaves projections into the water where the oil has eroded here, but the marsh still sticks out over here. Eventually that shoreline is going to try to get all of that marsh into the same contour, and so we start losing these promontories that are still sticking out into the water until we come back to a new shoreline. Some of our marsh edge stations that were a meter from the water's edge are now 8 meters out into the water because the shorelines have eroded so much. This isn't everywhere, but there is definitely some marsh erosion going on. Let me see. It's difficult to measure over a larger landscape this information because the complications of sea level rise and tides and lots of other things, which we found out to be the case. I've talked about this. We also know that 1 year is not enough time to find out what's happened. That's why it's this GOMRI research that funds programs over multiple years is very important for us. Some things were affected, some things were not. We expected oysters to have more difficulty becoming settled onto spat. The spat settled onto the oyster clutch, but we didn't see that. You can do things in the laboratory that are going to make the oysters develop enzymes that show that they're trying to get rid of PAHs, but basically in the field, we could not determine the differences between oiled and unoiled areas more than we could the effects of salinity or some of the parasites. The biogeochemical processes of the marsh, you would think those of us in Louisiana would know how marshes operate, and it's been very difficult to actually tell a whole lot about the marsh because there's not that much good information about the marsh, especially the biogeochemical processes. And we put state-of-the-art measurements in place, and we now know a whole lot more about the marsh. We also know that the marsh was not affected in some ways, such as nitrification, denitrification rates. But we've also been doing greenhouse gas fluxes off of the marshes, and the oil sites had much lower CO2 flux and lower N2O flux and higher CH4 fluxes. And this gets into the carbon budget of what we've been talking about earlier. We heard from Dr. Spinrad. This is consistent across year and across season and across study sites. So this is something that's very real that's going on. We thought genomics, you know, how can we use genomics? Of course, a genomic person would say, we know exactly how to use genomics. But we have found out since then, by including several microbial community people in our studies, that we've learned a whole lot about the composition of the bacterial community, how it relates to the organic condition of the soils, and how that would relate to the possibility for erosion. So it's a very good link. You can see some priming effect of some of these marshes just by looking at the microbial communities. It was not an immediate response, and it was not linear. We saw lots of changes over time. These are the insects in the marsh that was studied by Hooper Bowie. And after the initial oiling, it looked like there were plenty of ants. But as you can see, as we went into 2010, 2011, into 2012, and 2013, we still had places that did not have certain sorts of insects in the marsh, and these insects support other aspects of the food web. And potentially, are we seeing some recovery in April 2014? Well, we'll know better when we get out there in the spring of 2015. Conflicting information on the phytoplankton somewhat from the literature, but some things compared to long-term data, which we have, is some things are increased during the year of the spill and some things did not increase. And it's not really consistent with the literature which ones are which. So just suffice it to say that the year 2010 with regard to dissolved oxygen on the shelf was not any different than any of the previous years and any of the subsequent years. We expected to see marsh nekton being affected. You can see it in the laboratory. You can see it if you look at the organismal level where there's high concentrations of oil. But if you're looking for population level or community effects, we just were not able to see those. And there are lots of reasons why maybe not. These are migratory organisms, although we've done tagging studies that show that they stick very close to their home range. Some of them do, but some of them move. The otoliths that were talked about earlier have not proven successful, but these are very short-lived fish. They're not the larger, longer-lived fish. But we're now able to mark the otoliths and tagged killifish, let them go, recollect them, and look at the growth increments depending on where they are in the marsh habitat. So some other aspects that we looked at, especially with the food web and insects, is the success of seaside sparrows reproductively and looking for enzymes that would indicate that they're trying to metabolize PAHs. And in the oiled compared to the unoiled plots, less chicks fledged the nest in the oiled plots. One of the things, like many other the consortia, we just know so much more about the environment right now. And we know the condition, we know more about the environment and how they work, so that if there's ever another event like this, we would be better poised to determine exactly what the sentinels are and what sorts of things we should be looking at with further processing of oil. And of course, everything leads to more questions, but just for example, for the genomics, we have thousands, well, millions of sequences that are telling us more about the microbial communities and how they're moving through the food web. So even though the oil is declining, we expect to see some remaining effects either at population or ecosystem levels. There will not be recovery of all the habitats. Erosion is pretty much permanent where erosion has occurred. There'll be behavioral changes. The impacts that we've seen will probably diminish over time as the PAHs go down. The long-term monitoring, as been said earlier, is essential. And besides all this, we're going to be starting to do manipulative experiments because, as the oceanographers found out, you just can't throw oil into the ocean. So we're going to throw oil into mesocosms that have been primed to serve as very realistic surrogates of the marsh and manipulate those and try to see the changes that way. Thank you.